Welcome back to the Alexander Schmidt podcast. And this is our Contemplative Conversation 15, first time in some time. And we are here now with the recently wedded and now husband, Mr. Wes Schantz. Mr. Wes Schantz, welcome.
Hey, good to be back. How have you been?
I've been well. I've been traveling up to Spokane to see you
Same.
at your wedding, and it was really great to see you. And the listeners, they probably want to hear that you had your wedding in a beautiful park with a garden, and so some beautiful symbolism
Oh
behind
yeah.
your wedding. And I think actually you did something really neat that it took me some time to understand the meaning of, but and perhaps still I don't understand the meaning of, but something that you and your groomsmen did and your beautiful bride, Steph, now Chance, I suppose, SS, she did with her brides ladies. I'm forgetting what they're called for some reason.
Maids,
Yeah,
bridesmaids.
her bridesmaids. Oh my goodness, my
Yeah.
Nashville fans would be appalled at me forgetting something about a wedding. But you were all wearing either the bridesmaids wore belts made out of maps, and
Uh-huh.
the groomsmen wore ties that were maps, and even on the tables there were
Yes.
flowers made out of maps too.
Yes. That was our kind of like colors were blue and green, and then we used a lot of map themed decorations since we love to travel and are hoping to get to do more of that in the years to come.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I had also two other thoughts about what might have been going on there. I was wondering because, of course, you and I are I wouldn't say so much fans as readers of Maps of Meaning
Oh yeah.
by Jordan Peterson, and his claim being there that sort of stories are how we orient in the world, because stories
Right.
are themselves four-dimensional accounts of something that happens. They have characters who move through time, and therefore it's four-dimensional.
Yeah.
Which sort of reminds me, and I would like to talk about this at some point, and I will be talking about this at some point with talking about a fifth dimensional space, like a tesseract
Huh.
within Interstellar,
Oh,
where
right on.
time is represented physically, so you can just sort of go through moments in time as if they're a library in a library, which
Yeah.
is. But that made me wonder whether, sort of, at a wedding, which is of course a major moment in your life, with people from different parts of your life. You had people from your soccer team in Spokane. You had people from a few hours away who were friends of Steph growing up. You had friends like me who flew up from San Diego or from down in and
Arizona.
down in Phoenix, either being graduate school friends or teaching friends. You had your friends from childhood as well as your parents from the East Coast. And it made me wonder whether sort of what a person and their relationship is to you is like a landmark on a map,
Huh.
that it is your moments with others, your meaningful experiences that you share, which create orienting moments in your life that reveal to you both who you are at that moment and the path which you find yourself on.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I was
Yeah.
wondering, yeah. So I was wondering if the maps also might have been sort of physical representations of what friendship and relationships to others have been for
Yeah.
you in your life.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely metaphor. Like we so rarely these days get to, send actual letters to people, but
Mm.
for weddings we still do, and so you sort of like encounter geography in a literal way there, and we kind of went one further with that, and we did it as like little postcards that had maps on them, of course, of we drew little lines with markers from their location to Spokane to show them like here's the path you go on. And so it's sort of, yeah, the idea of the landmark or the destination and the origin and the path between them, all of that sort of is implied there, and I think connects really nicely with the relationship between people. It's sort of metaphorically pretty spot on with the relationship between places and perhaps, if you like, the stories about them, the events that take place in time and all that good stuff too. Yeah, I think it's a very rich like semantic space, the map. I think Peterson's book, um, doesn't do enough with it, honestly. Like,
Mm.
it's a very long book. There's a lot in there, but he doesn't really say much about maps per se.
Right.
After the first chapter or two. So I thought he could have done a little more with that, honestly.
Well,
But,
especially because just, the image we use to promote this conversation we're having is a labyrinth. And a labyrinth is generally, at least traditionally, sort of a hedge maze rather.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a garden. It is a sculpted garden that uses the intelligence of man in order to sculpt a natural space into a puzzle that man can then figure out. And so it's as if man alters the terrain in order to produce his highest quality, which would be rational thought, or the ability to solve a problem, and precisely through the ability to find his way to his goal. And what that makes me think about with a map, given the fact that we as animals are psychological animals, and in fact we have psychological territory as well as physical territory, right? Like we've talked about, fields of study is literally how we describe it. Or let's go, that's your territory. I'm not going to mess with, lyric poetry. I'll stick with the epic stuff. So what that makes me wonder, thinking about the image of a labyrinth in connection with a map, and specifically with marriage, is whether what a map truly represents, or at least what a map in conjunction with a labyrinth presents, is what it is that we are all looking for as people. And what it seems that we're looking for is not necessarily a physical space or like a physical home, which I think is a point that both the Odyssey and the Aeneid, well, and also, of course, Milton's Paradise Lost and the Divine Comedy makes, but that we make our homes through developing a psychic connection to something or someone there by having a meaningful experience that we then remember, which then remains in our memory, in the service of our minds for the rest of our lives. That that the true mental map doesn't lead us to any specific place, but to a person or a group of people or a place where something that we love happens.
That makes a lot of sense. The idea of the labyrinth, I mean, it's one that is often sort of tenebrous, right? Like shadowy and scary and whatnot. But it's equally, I think, important, like you say, to think of it as the garden maze, and the way that the layout is designed. And this is like any good video game dungeon, right? Like it's designed to be sort of scary, but completable, and sort of like you can see the whole. Once you get to the middle or to the goal of it, you see the whole picture, and you're glad that it was a bit of a challenge, that sort of thing.
And the fact of a map suggests trust too, because the idea is that the map is correct, A, and that the person who has drawn the map knows what they have drawn, and that it correlates with reality, B, which sort of suggests to me that if we have stories, and if our stories, as Peterson suggests, are maps of meaning, that the fact that we have and share stories with each other, whether they be fiction or nonfiction, and I don't mean lying when I mean fiction, I mean having an objective structure but different, but perhaps non-factual specifics. So like you can have people who are married, but they're actually snake people. So marriage exists, but snake people don't, so far as we know. That the idea seems to be, sorry, like usual, losing my thoughts whenever I make a funny aside. Yeah.
Yeah, well, fiction and nonfiction stories as maps of meaning. That's where I think you digressed from.
And what did I say right before that? I'm sorry. Yes, I agree with myself that they're maps of meaning.
I think you were saying something about where these are like
yes,
of art or something like that. I'm not sure.
The fact that a story exists suggests that there is something true about it. That there is that if somebody has taken the time to make a map to a meaningful moment or experience, that perhaps following the map will lead, that the faith of a map that has been made seems to be that if you follow it, you will reach the same experience as the author of the map.
Okay.
And so if that's a physical place, if like say Christopher Columbus makes a map to the New World and you follow this map, then you get to the New World and you experience a new world. Incredible. But with a story, it's potentially even more interesting because a storyteller is attempting to convey a certain experience or event in a certain way that they've either experienced or imagined. And so sort of the magic of being a human is that we can convey experiences to each other. And I guess this sounds like a sort of bland point, but come to in an interesting way, that we can convey stories to each other that convey true experiences to each other without actually producing the conditions that produce the original experience. So
okay.
So
kind of shortcut.
So it's like we can have the experience of the real thing through the map. Just
yes.
Well, that
that seems like a pretty strong refutation of the old conundrum raised by postmodernism over this, long century, especially. But it pops up before that as well. That there's like an impossibility of exchanging experience or sharing a true picture of the world or something like that, right? Like, for all that has some validity to it, what you're describing sounds like a fairly comprehensive way to answer such a critique by saying, well, no, like there is the possibility of an honest and true, in the sense that it actually corresponds to reality, expression, not only of something physical, like an actual map, but also something imaginative or metaphorical or whatever.
Right.
Like I said, artistic.
Right. Just because culture, and so this is something Steven Pinker mentions in The Blank Slate, and I know you're reading his Enlightenment Now, and I know that we're both sort of hip to him through the work by Jonathan Haidt, who also sort of hipped us both, also like Jordan Peterson, to the work of E.O. Wilson. And so it seems like just because we have not only a physical nature but also a cultural nature, and even though things in a cultural sphere can change very quickly, that doesn't make them any less real than that which is natural. In fact, especially if you consider the fact that, and this is the biologists seem to have settled this as well as the psychologists now, if humans have a nature, which they do because they share a phylogenetic and ontogenetic developmental pattern, we all have the same species development that has led to us over the past several 100 million years. But also we develop morally along the same stages as Piaget and Kohlberg have shown as well. And so if culture is the output of humans, then culture is a direct reflection of the nature of humans. Then we are the sorts of creatures that produce culture as a function of our territory, our environment, which does not make it less real. In fact, it makes it seem more real to us if that is our unique song that we produce, even though the song changes rapidly because of the law of accelerating returns that Ray Kurzweil goes into in every single one of his books. What is most real about us seems to be the story which we all inhabit together and produce together and can understand together, because psychologically and physiologically speaking, we are isomorphic. And so it would make sense that if we were the sorts of creatures that can use language, and we use language in the service of producing stories which share experiences, that precisely what would make a community of individuals possible would be articulating their shared experiences in order to share more experiences with each other, which would then draw them closer together, which Jonathan Haidt's work in The Righteous Mind actually shows proof that the tighter knit and more trusting and more unified a group is, if it fights against another less unified group, it wins. And this is a major claim I've been making in my Iliad lectures the entire time, that the reasons the Achaeans win is they're more unified. They speak the same language. There are more of them. They fight in a more disciplined manner. They have more disciplined gods. They have a more rigorous hierarchical structure. It's all confirmed. And that all just goes back to saying, is the fact that we can speak and use stories evidence that we can just make things up and that there's no such thing as truth? No. And that doesn't make any evolutionary sense in terms of producing group welfare or intra group welfare. Intergroup is a little more difficult, as we all know, since Hobbes, and because we live in, of course, we all live within groups. But the idea seems to be that what we use stories to do is to bond together within a group tighter, so that when intergroup conflict happens, as all you have to do is read any history or look at any newspaper to see it always happens, then you are safer and stronger and better prepared. And so a question I might ask from a pragmatic angle is, if the stories you share with each other produce greater trust, which makes you a stronger and more secure force, and that's a real effect in the world that makes you more successful in the world, from an evolutionary angle, does that make the truth that stories convey less real or more real than physical facts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one way to look at the what I call the postmodern. I mean, I'm not giving it maybe a very careful elaboration of its position or whatever, but I think one way to think about it is that it is in itself a story, right? Of course, it's creating a kind of orderly narrative of the way that things are, and it's positioning itself in a way against a dominant, as it sees it, a long time dominant narrative of the way that things are. And then if it's not entirely logically consistent within itself, it doesn't really matter too much, right? If that's not its concern. If its concern is,
that's so smart. So, okay, let me ask you a couple questions. The first question is then the sort of intuition you're getting there that it doesn't need internal consistency because it's essentially a blunt weapon. It's not meant to be its own coherent system, but to be used as, like, say, a virus or a plague or a disease or a weapon against a coherent system of thinking or story. That it has sort of created a straw man story that it dubs the patriarchy, which has elements of truth, which is enough to convince people who are only looking for a pattern, right? And so something interesting about that is that Jonathan Haidt has done work that shows that our natural proclivity, and everybody's heard of the confirmation bias, is to, when we see elements of a pattern, to look for additional evidence that confirms the pattern. But what does that mean that we don't look for naturally? Well, it means that we don't naturally look for counter evidence, which makes sense because our prefrontal cortex came around long after many of our pattern receptors were already built in. We have something like 300 million pattern receptors in our brains. It's tremendous redundancy. So the most sort of natural way for humans to think is to notice patterns. And if you remember any of the sort of IQ or standardized tests you took growing up, pattern recognition and manipulation of spatial objects would have been a major part of the quantitative sections. And so postmodernism only has to have enough truth to suck in people who are only looking for enough truth to say that something might be true. And so it can then use its lack of internal consistency to attack the strawman version of the prevailing Western story, which it calls the patriarchy, because all it has to do as a sophistical argument rather than a sophisticated system is shake the foundations of the system which exists if it's just a weapon. And so if it is itself not internally consistent, what will it attempt to attack, which would, if it's a sophisticated virus, what should it attack if it actually wants to ensure the crumbling of, say, the Western story? Well, the foundations. And what is the foundation of Western philosophy? Well, one of the major ones seems to be logic or internal consistency of story, that things make sense in this story, and that's why things work. And so,
that there is truth, that there is truth and the honest attempt to convey it like matter in some way. Yeah.
Right. And so just to get to what we were supposed to be talking about the entire time, part of what we wanted to talk about here was that over the past 40 years or so, several leading thinkers in several different disciplines, neuroscience, psychology, political science, have been sort of pilloried for sharing publicly scientific research that they've done without a bias. And so we see figures like Warren Farrell, who wrote Why Men Earn More, and himself worked for the National Organization of Women as its president for several years and wrote the book in order to help women make more and know the tricks necessary to do it. In fact, one of his chapters talks about how if they join, the military, if they join, say, the Marines, 0 female Marines died in the Middle East in the 2000s. And he's like, well, you can get danger pay, and most likely you won't die, since no women have died. And so he's definitely team women. And then you get people like E.O. Wilson coming out with his sociobiology, which later was dubbed evolutionary psychology, which David Buss has done a lot of good work in, who gets pilloried. He was called a fascist. And because of talking about the individual fitness of humans. And then you have Steven Pinker, a psychologist, who literally lists over 20 pages, 12 bullet point paragraph facts about proven scientific differences between women and men, all facts are taken from his female colleagues. So it's like, okay. And then of course you come to today when you have a figure like Jordan Peterson, who literally cites E.O. Wilson and Franz de Waal, who was an anthropologist who talked about the morality or the lack of morality of chimpanzees, saying they had the building blocks, or talks about Piaget, or talks about Pinker, and actually has talked to Warren Farrell and Pinker, and Dr. Richard Heyer, who does, of course, IQ research. He's talked to them publicly. And what's just so amazing to me about like sort of this postmodern attack against not only Peterson, but all of these other scientists, is that their books exist. Like I have them right in front of me, and they have full bibliographies. And it's like the Steven Pinker book. It's a Penguin. It's put out by a professional publishing house, Penguin. It's a New York Times bestseller. He's a Harvard psychologist. He has hundreds of scientific references in the back, which I can easily look up. It's the exact same with Haidt's book. It's the exact same with Richard Hare's book. It's the exact same with Maps of Meaning. What my hang up is how is it that that these people are getting pilloried for saying things that their research colleagues, who are also liberal, every single one of these thinkers is liberal, and half of them came from Harvard, E.O. Wilson, Pinker, and even Peterson was at Harvard for a time. It's like, how do we get away with criticizing them without substance? It
seems to be a bit of a fear response, right? Like a snap response. Like if you don't look very carefully and you're getting your information secondhand from someone who's got an active mind, it's easy to like paint them in pretty horrifying colors. But if you take a little bit of time and actually read what they say, I mean, not only is it well supported with factual, informational kind of studies and statistics and all that good stuff, but it's like very clearly laid out and like very reasonable as well. It's not like they're not like rhetorical in the sense that Nietzsche, for example, is like rhetorically dangerous. They're much more writing to be understood, which is kind of refreshing, and scientific and all that. Yeah.
What's incredible because it's sort of giving me a view into what our project has been, because you and I would say a year ago, were not interested in reading sociobiology or cybernetics. I mean, maybe you were, but I didn't even know about a lot of this stuff, or cybernetics, or like the work in political science Warren Farrell has done. But something that Peterson constantly said when he was giving his lectures that I started listening to last year on Maps of Meaning is read up on the things I quote.
Exactly.
Look at my bibliography. Go read these people. And it's been shocking. All of his claims about gender in terms of how much they make and the differences in their brain are in Warren Farrell in his book, The Boy Crisis. They're all in Pinker's The Blank Slate. Like, these issues are already scientifically done. The Blank Slate was written in 2002 by Pinker. Yes. That was 16 years ago. And he was settling all these issues. And if you try to, and it's like, well, if you don't trust him, you need to understand, well, how science works. He is a Harvard psychologist with the most books written of anybody in his department, which means he is the top psychologist in the world by the best metric we have. As believed, or rather as accepted by everybody, everybody who, well, at least is on his staff, which is the best staff in the world because it's Harvard, the best school in the world, but also everybody at the New York Times and everybody else. I'm not sure how you could have better credentials than the best. And
Right.
and then like you said, it's not confusing prose that these guys write, and not like Nietzsche. They're not esoteric. They're not philosophers. They're scientists who will write giant books that are not too giant, they're full of, sort of natural prose that can sell they can sell enough to be New York Times bestsellers. So again, it's sort of like, how are the journalists missing this? How is the public missing this? It's almost as if what we are doing, just to return to my original point, is being like a new sort of investigative journalist. So rather than being PhDs or traditional journalists out in the field, what we seem to be are intellectual journalists. Because what we've done, rather than several of our friends who have been totally content to just read superficial articles about Peterson and just stay on the surface level of talking issues, is we've actually dug in to his source base. We're reading people like Arthur Jensen, E.O. Wilson, Pinker, Farrell, and not just them. We read Rogers, we read Piaget. We're reading everybody. And what it seems to come down to is, oh my God, there's tremendous consensus between all of these best thinkers we have ever had using best methods and tools and most expensive ones ever developed. It's like we're actually in the opposite position of where the postmodernists would try and convince us to be. This is a point I brought up. I had a really great date today, right? And so something I brought up is I was like, well, sort of the claim that seems to be made is that, we're an oppressive patriarchy. And it's like, okay, sure, maybe. But something you need to keep in mind is, think of Cuba. People to leave Cuba in order to make it to America would risk their lives on floating on like barely sailable floating rafts, which if any storm or large wave came, which makes me think of the interstellar 10,000-foot wave, which was terrifying, they're dead. So they're willing to risk death to leave. If I want to leave America, all I have to do is go 30 miles south, I'm in San Diego, and walk through a turnstile that doesn't even have an attendant at it. It's like, that's not the same. I can freely come and go. And someone might say, well, that's a weak argument. It's like, how is that a weak argument?
Well, so I think part of what Haidt points out, which is important, and I know that Peterson makes this point as well, is that there's pretty solid evidence for where people get their political leanings, right?
Yes.
In terms of personality and certain principles that they consider to be of greatest significance for whatever reason, right? Not to like reduce them to that, but to sort of like, give evidence for and try to explain some of what's behind those like political beliefs. And so the spectrum seems to be, pretty well balanced in this country, like where you have the freedom to be very inflammatory on whichever end of it you want to be on, right? You have the ability to say a lot of stuff which is totally unsubstantiated, but then you also at the same time have the ability to say a lot of stuff which is well substantiated. And when you put all those things out there in the market for people to look at, inevitably, in the absence of a kind of tyranny or all sorts of totally horrible things which are possible but which haven't happened yet. So like those true, substantiated claims will out, right, over time.
Right.
That seems to be like what I would come back to is like, like of course people can say a lot of stuff and just like not spend the time or the attention to look closely at the competing claim, and that's okay. But I'm not going to really waste a lot of time bemoaning that fact. I think it's gonna be okay.
Right. Well, it's like we can take the conversation to a totally different place. It's like these thinkers that are being pilloried, the ones I've mentioned before, the biologists, the psychologists, the political scientists. They all have public works that exist in physical space that reference works that you can find in academic journals, and many of which for free, or you can get around the paywall in some way or another. Maybe you can just pay, but you probably don't have to. I'm even part of a Facebook group where like poor scholars ask for people to send them letters. It's called the Philosophical Underclass. And so
That's awesome.
It's almost like I don't know, like we're at a crossroads where it's like, okay, well, let's look at these sort of Marxist postmodern claims and let's start addressing them actually. So
Yeah,
like,
right.
when my grandmother, and someone can claim this anecdotal, but I can produce the evidence from the boy crisis. I can produce the exact evidence from the National Labor Union or National Labor Bureau. Like when my grandmother was in medical school, there were 3 women there at the Georgia Medical College. The date I recently went on today, I'm going to sound like Ben Shapiro, was with a doctor. And she said, well, it was more like there were 65%. She was at, I actually forget exactly what school she's at, so it's a good thing it's not a second date. But she said that there was something like 65% women, and that actually accords with something Warren Farrell said. Then several of the care professions, especially sort of white collar ones like nursing and being physicians, the women are actually now getting to where they're sliding over the 50% range in terms of how many there are in a profession. And it's like, okay, well, even if, and I sent you a picture of this, that the most recent New Yorker still makes the claim that there's a wage gap, even though Warren Farrell 20 years ago wrote a book, Why Men Earn More, which has 25 reasons why, or 25 things that men tend to do in order to increase their incomes that women can do too. And so the fact that that sort of claim is still thrown out there without evidence seems, well, totally absurd. I mean, just 2 things I can say to that is, for one, it's not all men that make more than women. The vast majority of the top 500 CEOs in the world are men, and you might just well say they make more than anybody in the world, regardless of their gender, and they simply happen to be men. Warren Farrell lists this out because it tends to take 20 years, 6 days a week of 16 hours a day to become CEO. That does not sound like oppression or tyranny. That sounds like a choice of a very hard life. And mix that with obsession. Yeah, an obsession. That's exactly right. An obsession with an idea, which, again, research shows that who's more likely to be obsessed with ideas rather than people? Men at the right end of the distribution. And so, as we know, women and men are mostly the same. But when you have overlapping normal distributions, which are not 100% together, then you have major differences at the tails. So with men and women, most of them are interested in both people and things, but at the right hand of the distribution, who's the most interested in things? Well, men. And how would that translate into a career? Well, engineers. Okay, that's an interest issue. Is that an oppression or social construction issue? No. Match that with the fact that women have been are now outperforming men in elementary school, middle school, high school, college, and women under 30 who are single make more than men. And you see that women are increasingly taking over and dominating professions like nursing and being physicians. I can produce the actual statistics on that. I can't just off the top of my head here. And it's like something seems to be happening which is not cohesive with the postmodern narrative. Something real seems to be happening. And what sort of just strikes me is, why is it that this information is not difficult to find? Why is it not being highlighted? Why are these facts, which actually show that we're in a very good place relative to the story we're being told, why are they remaining hidden until like 2 schmoes like you and I like go digging for them?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, the names that you've cited, like I haven't read all of that much, but yeah, within the past year or so, I've tried to get a little better read in the science, and even just sort of the synthesis, or whatever you might want to call it, consilience, right? Is E.O. Wilson's word. That's sort of coming about, and that book was written, like 30 years ago. So yeah. it's not a new thing, it's not new, but I agree that the critical mass or something seems to be coming to a head here, to mix some metaphors, right? It's like, right. There is so much overwhelming evidence from one end, and there's so much overwhelming rhetoric from the other end,
Mm.
and they're sort of like meeting in this this colossal fire versus water thing going on, right? And what comes out of that, right, is steam, right? So a lot of fog, a lot of
I'm going to give a
so
hypothesis. So one thing we've done on this podcast is, as we are the sort of humanitarians, and Peterson and his crew are the scientists, and something Peterson has often said is that he wishes his work to be sort of the framework or the foundation of those who will be the humane scientists moving forward, the people like us who can use his research to make broader connections. And sort of the idea I'm starting to come to is something he often mentions is that the media represents him because, or at least newspaper and print and TV media as it currently is dying. And that's not such a big claim given the fact that most companies only last something like 30 years, and industries as they are of course going to change more and more rapidly given the law of accelerating returns. And just because, say, print media disappears doesn't mean that news disappears. But what that suggests to me is, if most people are still getting the vast majority of what they hear from, say, traditional news sources, and what the traditional news sources no longer do is investigate what it is they're producing deeply, but rather investigate the thoughts and opinions that those of similar mindsets to them have about that which they should be investigating, it shows me what the major deadly problem of traditional print journalism is, that they fail to attempt to understand that which they criticize, and then, just like a gossiping ninny, share that which other people are saying without a critical apparatus to judge it. And so they're saying, well, this is what everybody's saying, and they're all mad at Jordan Peterson, and because they're saying these things about him and are mad, therefore they must have good reason for it. And so we're going to report on this. Then people are going to read, more people are going to read about how people are angry and are criticizing this guy, though we don't understand the reasons. And in order to be part of this in-group, you have to be mad at this guy and criticize him. And if you ask any questions, then you're outside of the in-group, and we're going to hate you because obviously we have good reason to be mad. But it's a self-perpetuating cycle. It's like, you just always then, now I see. You just always then group around collective anger at someone, and I'm just imagining these like Twitter witch hunts we see against people. They'll step out of line. They'll make some comment that gets perceived as sexist or racist or anything like that, and we got to ruin them, right?
Well, I would just clarify, like, I mean, there's got to be a line that you draw where it's like, that thing they said is not okay or whatever.
Sure, right.
But that's really different from what you're describing. Yeah, I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like
Trump up.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, it's just the way that this can spiral and become sort of ludicrous to any like reasonable person looking at it from the outside is definitely a thing, definitely a problem. My response to it, like I said, is to like spend my time reading better things.
Right.
That's what I would counsel people to do. So
read the sources. Read the sources. And I mean, that's a legitimate way to discredit someone, right? If I make a claim and then you read the books I claim to have read and they say different things from what I've said they say, then that's good evidence that I'm either a fool or a liar. But if I cite these sources, and they do exist, and they are rigorous science, well, what should we change then? Our hypothesis, or do we change the facts?
Exactly. It's that frame of reference, which is easy to sort of collect under the name postmodern or whatever you want to call it, right? Which it's this kind of lens of interpretation, which seems to be breaking down, right? Over about 100 years or whatever, it's kind of been in the ascendancy, I'm not sure. But anyway, at this point, it's like, okay, we need a new model for the humanities to follow. Like they're clearly not faring well with this one. So yeah, I think this humanistic scientific kind of synthesis is like very promising.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's like we chose the wrong direction. We read some French thinkers at Yale in the 70s, like Derrida and Foucault, and they said, actually, everything is interpretation. And
I don't think anyone read them, but it's a chamber effect where it's like, that's the name to like throw around right now.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that was the bane of my undergraduate classes. I remember reading Jacques Lacan after reading Foucault and Derrida, and I just remember thinking, I don't understand. Like I read Plato and Aristotle, and I get something out of them. I read Carl Jung, and I get something out of him. But these guys, it's hard to understand what they're saying at all. This culture of posturing and moving forward. But it seems like there were two ways we could have gone, two directions if we were following the map. And one was everything's interpretation. And since we know we're mental and articulate beings now, we, like God, can just speak things into existence and they're true. And it's like, no, wrong. No, you actually have to work, and like you have to be far more Wittgensteinian. The world is everything that is the case. If you can imagine it, there is the potential for you to figure out how to manifest it in the world with your hands, right? You have to manufacture. That's literally what it means, to make by hand in this world. If you are a human, you can't just speak things into existence. The other way we could have gone is, it seems as if we as humans have a critical apparatus. We can interpret things. But since we occupy a physical and moral world, there are lots of restrictions on our behavior and our thoughts that make it so that even if we can think infinite things in our head, there are only a finite amount of things that can work in reality. And so now that we have such sophisticated measures with science across several different disciplines, anthropology, biology, sociology, psychology, sociology not as good right now, we can actually start to, rather than dreaming up infinite possibilities of thought, figure out the actual ways of interpreting the world, which might help us to be more effective within it, or to adapt more practically to the world, or to become a more unified people. It's as if not what we could do if we turned around, if we converted our gaze, if we paid attention, is we could use all this until now sort of in the dark, sitting at the center of the labyrinth, information and science, in order to have a much clearer idea of what reality and what we actually are. So rather than obscuring what we are and assuming we can't know anything, I would suggest that we're actually in a position to know ourselves and our world much better than we ever have.
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting. It's the kinds of categories of thought which are in vogue now. In many ways, you could say they mirror things which have come before. Talking about evolution, or talking about information and how it's becoming much more massively available. These are things that happen from time to time. But living now, it's like very exciting because they seem to all sort of be converging. Yeah.
Right. That's so interesting that you say that. And just as we're making the claim, or I'm making the claim in this podcast, that we're a new sort of investigative journalist, we also exist in a time when a claim has been made by someone like a Peterson that we're existing during a Gutenberg style revolution. So just the printing press brought information at mass, at large, to a larger populace. So now does the internet, and specifically YouTube, and specifically endeavors like ours here. We are, of course, two veteran teachers talking about what we're learning and what we know. Well, people not only have larger access to information, everybody has some sort of smartphone in the West, or a computer, or access to through public libraries at this point. Yeah. Right, exactly. That we are ourselves going through a Gutenberg revolution where all this information that does exist can now be proliferated. I guess wow, this is sort of amazing. I guess, just like in Interstellar, when Matthew McConaughey realizes that it's not they who was helping him out, but it's him. Or just like Harry realizes that it wasn't his father that sent the Patronus, but it was him. That potentially how we get this information out so that other people can see just what we've seen, so they can understand how crazy the situation is, well, by sharing it ourselves.
Yeah.
It's like, if we see it and it seems crazy and we're isomorphic with everybody else, probably if they see it and they see it's crazy, they'll think the same things we do, which seems to be how teaching and communication works too.
The concept of a spoiler, just to like throw this into the mix, I think is something like where you gotta you've got to not say everything, right? It's like you can't simply equate propagating information with people liking or being interested in or like acting upon it. So it's like those things are really I don't know. There is like a real problem there, which I think is worth investigating. And so I to be like very again frank, I haven't read enough of the people who fall under the label of like the forerunners of postmodernism, right? Like, but I'm working on it and see if I can actually make some sense of it. But I think it's that process of reading it for yourself, of seeing
yes,
a movie, or a story, like getting to the end of the story and actually being like blown away by the reveal, or like in a joke. You can't explain a joke and have it have the same effect as getting the joke. So there is something there, and it's important that we not totally throw that out,
right.
In questioning the validity, right, of other thinkers and whatnot who disagree, sometimes strongly, sometimes seemingly wrongheadedly, but there's room for a lot of people in the field.
That seems to be exactly what Peterson has done for us, that we're attempting to do for others. That it's like we're saying what we have figured out based on the data that we have had presented, and we are telling everybody exactly where the data is and what it is. We're laying it out for them in the same way that we have received it, in a more distilled way. But I mean, what you said seems to agree with exactly what we said earlier, which disagrees with the postmodern claim about the infinitude of stories, or the lack of truth of stories. That precisely the best way to teach somebody is to lay out the facts for them in the same way they were laid out for you, with the understanding that since they're isomorphic with you, they will have the same experience that you do, which does seem to be something we actually care about in reality. You might say, oh, that sounds very philosophical. And I say, okay, well, say we're both Westworld fans and the season finale is coming on, and I decide to tell you all about it before you get to see it. Will you be angry at me? Answer?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why? Because I spoiled it for you. How did I spoil it? Because I interrupted the sequence of facts you would have received in watching it in the same way that I did. It would lead you to having the same great experience that I did, that made me so excited that I decided to spoil the experience for you.
Right.
Which suggests, again, that stories have the power to produce the same effects in us, which, I mean, we're about to talk about Harry Potter in about an hour here. And it's like, I mean, the existence of that series of books alone is a disproof of part of postmodernism, in that it seems like that was a mass phenomenon, a collective phenomenon. These kids lining up, just like outside of a Star Wars show or movie, excuse me, I sound like an old man there, in order to what? Well, read the exact same story as everyone else and have a very similar unto same experience while reading it, that they'll then share with each other and bond over, right? Like, as we've been doing this Harry Potter series, we realize there's a Pottermore, there's this whole world that's been generating that people now connect over based on a story. It's like, how is that not real?
That's like the classic, right? You walk over and you kick the stone and you refute whatever it is. You refute it thus. I forget who tells that story. But anyway, anyone listening should definitely check out Interstellar. Just like try not to listen to the last little bit of what you said about it.
Yeah,
it's an awesome movie.
I apologize for that small bit, but at least it's a 2014 movie, so I don't feel so bad about it. It's been, and maybe within context of maybe if all interpretations are subjective, then they won't see the same sort of movie that I saw. So thus, if postmodernism is correct, there can be no spoilers, because you certainly won't see what I saw, so there's no need to even talk about it.
Well, yeah, but you and Babcock are talking about that soon, or sometime?
Very soon. Very soon. We're starting a section on space epics.
Sweet.
In the next week or so, and then we got Oscar back on for our third Great Men podcast on Darius the Great, Darius the First,
cool.
on Monday, and then you and
Mhm.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.